Greetings everyone, and a warm welcome to our co-hosts, to our guest speaker for today afternoon, Dr. Paul Walton, and to all our dear participants. Welcome to a seminar series on the digital future for business and society, perspectives on AI challenges and opportunities. This seminar series, and today is the 10th seminar that we are doing. This series is hosted jointly by Professor Yogesh Dwivedi. Professor Yogesh is the Professor of Digital Marketing and Innovation, founding director of the Emerging Markets Research Center, and co-director of research at School of Management, Swansea University, Wales in UK. And our co-host is Dr. Raman, who is director of Symbiosis Institute of Business Management, Pune, and also the Dean Faculty of Management at Symbiosis International University. Dr. Raman is a very keen researcher in everything related to AI and automation. To tell you a little bit about the seminar series itself, this is supported by the Center for Technology, Innovation, Management and Enterprise at the University of Kent, UK, Digital Marketing and Analytics Special Industry Group, Academy of Marketing, Grenoble IAE Graduate School of Management, which is an INP school of the University of Grenoble Alps, the Swansea iLab, Innovation Lab, Swansea University, the E-Business and E-Government Special Industry Group, British Academy of Management, and the UK Academy for Information Systems. To tell you some details about this seminar series, this is actually inspired by various perspectives on artificial intelligence and its transformative potential presented in a recent perspective article by Dwivedi et al. 2019. AI undoubtedly offers a huge transformative potential for the augmentation and potential replacement of human tasks and activities within a wide range of industrial, intellectual, and social applications. The pace of change for this AI technological age is staggering, with new breakthroughs in algorithmic machine learning and autonomous decision making, creating new opportunities for continued innovation. The impact of AI could be significant, with industries and sectors ranging from agriculture, finance, healthcare, manufacturing, retail, supply chain, logistics, and utilities, all potentially disrupted by the onset of AI technologies. The seminar series on the digital future for business and society, perspectives on AI challenges and opportunities, presents various perspectives from a number of leading expert speakers to highlight both opportunities and challenges posed by the rapid emergence of AI. Allow me now to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Paul Walton from Capgemini, UK, who will talk to us today about the successful transformations with AI. Dr. Paul Walton works for Capgemini and consults on digital transformation, automation, and AI. He has many years of experience of digital transformation, including AI, in several market sectors. In addition, he conducts research in information evolution and its application to business architecture and artificial intelligence. Paul, the floor is all yours. Over to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Sandeep, and hello everyone. Let me just share my screen first. Can somebody tell me if that's working? No, it's not.
Not yet.
Okay, here we go.
Yes. Yeah. Perfect. Maybe you put it on slideshow. Yeah, perfect. Yes.
Okay, thanks very much, Sandeep. So today I'm going to be talking about AI and transformation. we know that many businesses are already struggling with digital transformation. And we know that AI makes information processing more complicated, and that's likely to make transformation more difficult. So I'm going to be looking at organizations as information processing entities, and this will help us to understand the nature of the fundamental changes that transformation with AI needs to address. But we'll also see that human psychology limitations make these changes difficult for people to see and understand. And this analysis points to a set of principles that will help ensure the success of transformation with AI. So we're going to start off by looking at digital transformation and the lessons that we can learn for that. And then we'll talk about organizations as information processing entities and think about other complicated information processing entities like people, for example. And that'll help us to understand the limitations that information processing of a complex nature has in general. And these include, for example, the need to make trade-offs in how information processing is conducted. The way that habits in information processing are formed. And in terms of organizations, for example, this includes the impact of culture, for example. The way that information processing is fragmented, and we all know about the organizational silos in organizations and the impact that they can have. And the fact that information processing is fragmented means that we need to join together the fragments if we're thinking about how we can change them and transform. And finally, the importance of visibility. And what I mean by that is visibility of how information processing takes place in organizations. And actually, these four themes, four considerations, trade-offs, habits, fragmentation, and visibility apply to complex information processing of any kind. And there isn't time today to go into the theory underneath that, but I'll just touch on that very briefly. So we can think about these things in relation to AI and what that means, and therefore what the fundamental changes that we need to address concerning transformation and AI are. If we turn that on its head, we can understand then the principles that we need to inform our transformation with. As Sandeep said, we'll have some questions at the end, and I've included some further reading on the final slide which you'll be able to see when the slides are distributed. So let's start off by looking at digital transformation. This diagram on the left here is taken from a book called Leading Digital, which I've referenced. And it looks at the two dimensions that we need to consider with respect to digital transformation. And of course, these apply to AI as well. So the y-axis on the left there is about the individual capabilities that are implemented. So in the case of digital transformation, this could be, for example, the ability to show availability of stock on a website. And the enabling capability, the y-axis, is about what's needed to make that available on the website. So that could mean changes to the supply chain, changes to internal systems and processes and so forth. And these same considerations apply to AI as well. So if we're implementing a particular model, for example, perhaps to look at some insurance claims processing, if we want to deploy some AI capability, that's going to require a set of enabling capabilities internally to make that happen and enable it to scale across the whole organization. So this means that there are three levels that we need to consider about when we're thinking about AI transformation. The first is the individual AI capabilities themselves, and several other talks in this series have looked at particular examples of those, and there are many use cases in the literature. But secondly, we need to think about what enabling capabilities are required. So, for example, what does it mean in terms of the approach to organizational and culture change? If you don't get the organizational change right, then people won't trust the technology, for example. What does it mean for technology architecture, and how should technology architecture change with respect to AI? Machine learning feeds off data, so what does it mean for data and the governance of data and the way in which data is treated in the organization? And what does it mean for your delivery model? How can AI changes be integrated with other technology changes taking place at the same time? So, for example, if an AI change is part of an overall automation, how should those be integrated? And then finally, what does it mean in terms of how you understand how your organization works? And this is a theme that I'll come back to later in the talk. But then the third bullet point here is we know that we're living in an era of rapid change. So we need to think about transformation as a continuous process. So we need to think about how AI can make organizations easier to change, or perhaps the challenges that are associated with implementing AI and change. Now, we know that there are good techniques available for the individual parts of this. So, for example, there are good techniques available for organizational change, for culture change, for doing data science, for implementing systems and so forth. But to get at the fundamentals, we need to think about this in an integrated way. And so we're going to think about organizations as information processing entities, which incorporates all of these individual ingredients. Don't worry, this slide builds, so further components will be visible as I build the slide. But clearly organizations have to deal with the physical world. So it's the physical world outside the organization and the physical world inside the organization. And the physical world outside includes things like supply chain, customers, what's going on in the market, trends in society, and many other things. And inside the organization, there may be a set of assets to manage, there may be a set of processes that need to be understood, there could be devices, lots of IoT devices and events, and similarly lots of other things. Now, to understand and to interact with these things, we need to be able to understand what's going on in the physical world. We need to communicate with it and also provide instructions. So if we take, for example, an insurance claims process, suppose you're a car insurance organization, somebody has an accident. So first of all, you need to be notified that the claim exists, that the accident's happened. You need to understand about the accident. So perhaps that might be through photographs and information about the claim, and perhaps people may be injured and so forth. You may need to communicate about the claims, so maybe with third parties like breakdown services or so forth. And then finally, you may need to instruct them by telling a breakdown service to go and recover the vehicle, for example, and there may be all sorts of other things associated with that. But generally, this interaction will be governed by a set of process steps, and processes will include people and also technologies. And the way in which process steps combine will potentially be determined by what's found out during the process. So if we take the insurance claim example, it may be that at some stage one of the people involved in the accident has to go to hospital, so the nature of the risk may change considerably, and perhaps the nature of the cost as well, and so that may need to be routed to a specialist team within the insurer to deal with. And this process needs to use information, and the people and the technology need to be able to find information So for example, with the insurance claim, they need to be able to find the insurance policy. They need to be able to find documents relating to the claim so far. They need to be able to relate bits of information to each other. So they need to relate this claim maybe to the claims history for this particular person to understand what the claims history is. There may be some suspicious elements to the claims, so they may need to relate it to fraud databases and fraud services, for example. And they may need to convert information from one form to another. So the information may be stored in documents. They may need to extract data from documents and so forth. And of course, they may need to interact with third parties to collect information from them as part of this overall processing. But all of this information processing is governed to a greater or lesser extent by a set of organizational mechanisms. So all organizations have a set of mechanisms like budget allocation, like performance management, like the way they wish to evolve their strategy, which are designed to shape the way in which processing goes on in the organization, information processing goes on in the organization. And on the other hand, there are a set of constraints, like the culture of the organization, for example, that limit the possibility to process information in particular ways. And often these pressures and constraints aren't particularly well aligned with each other. The performance management or the set of values in the organization encourage a set of activities which are very difficult to achieve because of the constraints, for example. Or the performance management of one part of an organization contradicts what's required in another part of an organization. And one of the classic information processing constraints is people who are measured for delivery regardless of the quality of delivery. This is a well-known problem in IT. And the final part of this is visibility. So how well does the organization understand what it does? Clearly, if we want to change an organization, we need to understand what it does. And traditionally, this was considered in terms of things like enterprise architecture, business architecture, high-level thinking about what the organization does. But increasingly, there's a set of discovery tools, things like process discovery tools and technology discovery tools, which can find out what's actually going on in the organization. And in many cases, what's actually going on is different from the processes that have been designed or the technology that's the architecture that's been designed. And this question of whether the detail is aligned with the high-level view, or indeed whether there is a high-level view at all, and whether there is a detailed view, are really important when we're considering transformation. So this is the context in which AI is being implemented. So let's just have a quick look at the impact of AI on this. And the yellow boxes on this diagram are the ones where AI technology is being used right now in terms of what's going on. So if we go back to the insurance example, so understanding an insurance claim, so there's automatic recognition of images which determine the nature of the claim that's being made. The communication and indeed the instruction can be completely automated all the way through the process for simple claims. And so one of the other things that AI can be used for is to triage the claims, to decide which ones can be automated, which ones shouldn't be automated, when they need to go to a specialist team as the data changes and the nature of the risk changes. And as far as the information is concerned, then AI is increasingly used for things like document cognitive processing to extract the data that's needed from documents, to relate pieces of data together and to convert data into the various forms that are needed by the various systems and people that are involved throughout the organization. But typically, historically, the process steps often use rather crude business rules that increasingly become nigh on unmanageable, actually. And these business rules are increasingly being overtaken by the use of by AI and machine learning technology to base the decisions on the actual data rather than a set of rules that somebody designed an awful long time ago. This piece in the middle about the relationship between people and technology is very important, because the idea is to automate as much as possible, but we know that an awful lot of things won't for the foreseeable future be automated. And so the relationship between people and technology when AI is included becomes more and more important as the capabilities of the technology increase. The reason that these lines are in yellow is that AI can also help with the relationship between between people and technology. So the relationship between people and technology clearly is what the Turing test is all about. So AI is clearly important there. But between people, AI can be used to do things like translation, for example, of different people, and it can help teams work together more effectively. So what this diagram also highlights is a particular concern with AI at the moment, because the tools available to support all of these activities are widely available. All the cloud services, Amazon Web Services, Azure, Microsoft Azure, Google, and so forth, have very, very powerful libraries for doing this kind of thing. And the libraries are increasingly being made available in very simple forms for very untechnical people to use, for example, through the AI builder in the Microsoft Power Platform. For developers, very powerful libraries are available for languages like Python and all sorts of others. And increasingly, AI is becoming embedded in products that support these activities. So if we take the insurance example again, AI is being embedded in all sorts of different ways in standard insurance products that organizations can use. So the risk here is what you could call AI by stealth, that AI will be implemented at the whim of developers, technical people or business people, without the organizational governance in place to support it. But I think the final point on this slide is that AI will be pervasive. Even with the tools that exist at the moment, they're being implemented for hundreds, thousands of different use cases across organizations. What this diagram tells us is that the information processing in organizations is very complicated. So what can we learn about complicated information processing more generally? Well, we can start by looking at people. So people are important partly because they form an essential part in organizations, but also because there's been a considerable amount of research about them. So people make trade-offs when they process information. So even going back as far as the 19th century, researchers were talking about the principle of least effort, that people would use the least effort available to get hold of information. And more recently, this idea was refined by Herbert Simon in his theory of bounded rationality, that when people make decisions, their rationality is limited by the difficulty of the decision problem, their own cognitive limitations, and the time available to make the decision. So then people make trade-offs between time, effort, and quality. And these trade-offs are endemic to information processing of all kinds. So people make trade-offs. Secondly, people have habits with information processing. So I'm sure most of the people on the call have read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, where he talks about this System 1 and System 2. And there's been a whole load of subsequent research about whether it's System 1 and System 2 or whether there are several others. But nevertheless, the principle applies that there is a System 1 which operates fast and automatically, but has innate biases. And these innate biases are at the basis for the work going on in lots of organizations about unconscious bias and its impact and trying to restrict it. But in terms of information processing, the critical thing about System 1 is that System 1 is completely blind to the quality of the information that it looks at. In the words of Daniel Kahneman, when information is scarce, which is usually the case, System 1 operates as a machine for jumping to conclusions. Now that sounds like pretty bad news. I mean, System 2 is the conscious mind, what we think of as the conscious mind, but that takes a lot of effort to invoke. And normally what we do is driven by System 1, not System 2. The good news is that System 1 can be trained, so you can actually train System 1 to operate in a sensible manner, but that doesn't get rid of all the biases. So people have habits in their information processing. Third point is that their information processing is fragmented. It's fragmented in terms of neuroscience. One of the references at the back talks about the multiple inference mechanisms that people use. It's also fragmented in terms of the intellectual tools that people adopt and the way they go about thinking. So, for example, in a famous essay last century, C.P. Snow wrote about the two cultures, about arts versus sciences, and the need to build bridges between the two. And we can still see the importance of this in the public sector, in government policy, that people who are good at policy activities are often very good at deliberately ambiguous presentation of information and deliberately ambiguous information processing, whereas the people who implement the policies need very precise, rigorous, much more scientific thinking. And this is a clash in the public sector and has been for certainly in the UK and has been for an awful long time. And finally, visibility. People aren't aware of how they think about things. So again, this first point here, what you see is all there is. It comes from Daniel Kahneman, that people's System 1 is used to making judgments only in terms of what's immediately apparent. And it's worth thinking about this in the context of organizational decision-making, clearly. And the second point, magic. Again, one of the books in the further reading is about the neuroscience of magic. To quote the authors, magicians exploit the fact that your brain does a staggering amount of outright confabulation, wonderful word, to construct the mental simulation of reality known as consciousness. So in other words, the brain puts together fragments of information, fragments of thinking, and presents it as if it's a coherent whole. And one of the ways in which magic works is that it exploits the gaps between these different ways of these different parts of the mental thinking. So if we consider this picture as a whole for a bit, it doesn't present a very good picture. It presents a picture in which complicated information processing has challenges, certainly with respect to people. So let's consider whether these same type of challenges apply to organizations as a whole. It turns out that they do. So we talked about organizational trade-offs earlier, that there are several organizational mechanisms for enabling people to focus on what they need to focus on within the time and budget constraints that they have available. So the aim of these objectives is explicitly to make trade-offs about how information is processed, where we're thinking about information processing in this wider sense that includes organizational processes and people and technology together. And that there are also constraints. Organizations have limited capabilities in terms of what people can do and what their technology can do, and that constrains what's available. Secondly, organizations have habits with respect to information processing. So this quote about culture is again from one of the references at the back, but culture is the beliefs, values, and behavioral norms that come to be taken for granted and eventually drop out of awareness. And there's two critical points to this. They come to be taken for granted. It's what we do around here. It's the way we do it in this organization. And secondly, they eventually drop out of awareness. So it's the way we do it in this organization, but we don't know why. So as well as the cultural elements, habits get embedded in processes and systems. And what the system does after a while, or what the process does, becomes the organizational habit. Again, whether that still applies or not. Of course, habits can be good or bad, but good habits even don't persist if they don't get reinforced. So use it or lose it. And this applies historically to things like business continuity. You know, you hope you never need to invoke business continuity, but if you do, you need to know that it's going to work, so you need to practice it. And the same is true of organizational change. Organizations that don't practice organizational change tend not to be very good at it. And so if transformation is lumped up into big lumps with several years apart, then it's much less likely to be successful. Fragmentation is a classic problem of organizations. Organizational silos exist in large organizations, and silos apply not just to the organizational teams themselves, but also to the technology and to information. And the information silos can be in with respect to technology, because you need to get at them through a particular system, or they can be with respect to people. There's only one person in the organization who's the expert on a particular topic, and he's not available at the moment. And these gaps between silos can be very large. Different functions, for example, have different ways of thinking about things. So finance people think about information in a very different way from marketing people. And one of the classic gaps between silos is between business organizations and IT. And this gap is so large that a number of specialist roles have been filled to fill the gap. So for example, business analysts convert information about business requirements into user stories, for example. And then developers convert user stories into code. Now, if these gaps between silos are not handled in a sensible way, then it means that they become very brittle. So if something changes slightly, then the relationship between the pieces no longer works, and that makes change extremely difficult. Finally, we talked about visibility before. There's visibility in terms of the high level, the enterprise architecture, business architecture, high-level technology architectures. But increasingly, people are talking about technical debt. So technical debt is the gap between what you should have done when you implemented technology in terms of the architecture and what you actually did. So a typical example is marketing or someone want to do something urgently, so something gets done, but it's not implemented thoroughly, maybe it's not tested thoroughly, maybe it's not integrated thoroughly, and that's technical debt. And one of the difficulties with organizations is that technical debt accumulates. So good practice, and again there's a reference in the back about DevOps. Good practice insists that you should manage technical debt. But by analogy with technical debt, you can also talk about process debt, which are the little workarounds that people have with their processes, and the steady deviation of actual practice on processes from what you think's happening. And the same with data, and the quality of data gradually degrades. So there's a large number of activities at the moment that organizations go through around discovering what the processes actually are, discovering what the technology actually does, and there's a whole lot of tools available to do that. A couple of years ago, I was working for a large manufacturer on their application strategy. And the fundamental problem they had was that they didn't know what applications they had. So clearly with big applications like SAP and all those kind of big applications, yes, they knew what they were and those were all managed thoroughly. But typically you have a long tail of applications. They had a list of, I think, 1,500 applications. But they didn't know that the list was right. And for most of them, they didn't even know what they did. Certainly, there was no one they could find who could tell them what they did. They just heard that they existed somewhere. And in bigger organizations, it's typical that you have this long tail of applications that nobody understands well. So these look like fundamental problems that aren't going away at the moment. And in fact, that's because it's inevitable that these will be issues in any complicated information processing entity. So suppose we've got an information processing entity that's interacting with its environment. To interact with its environment in a competitive landscape, it needs to understand the state of the environment. It needs to understand the potential outcomes that can happen. And it needs to be able to relate the one to the other through a set of actions or plans or whatever. Now, this is fantastically complicated and extremely difficult. And because we do it the whole time, we're just unconscious of how hard this is. But the combinatorial complexities involved in this are absolutely mind-bogglingly huge. So what happens is that any information processing entity has to simplify. It has to do what's good enough in its current environment. So it makes trade-offs, and the trade-offs get embedded in shortcuts. And eventually, the rationale for this, if the rationale was ever known, because it may just be trial and error, gets lost. Now, this isn't, if we think about organizations, this isn't just true for the organization as a whole, it's true for pieces of the organization as well. In those cases, the environment of the team, for example, the environment of the team is composed partly of the rest of the organization. And each of these teams has a different environment, so it makes different trade-offs, so it processes different information in different ways. So all of these four themes that we talked about before, the trade-offs, the habits, the fragmentation, and the visibility are a natural outcome of the complexity of information processing in changing environments. Now, there's a lot more detail about this in the references, and there's no time to go into it now. But what we're talking about is a set of fundamental issues that organizations will need to address. So let's think about transformation now. Back to transformation. Transformation is information processing. It's about changing an organization which can be described in a particular way into a different organization. So it suffers from the same limitations. Now let's look at a kind of typical example of what can happen. If a set of operational pressures are applied to transformation, then what tends to happen is that visibility isn't present. Organizations do things, technical debt accumulates, process debt accumulates. So when they want to change something, they don't really know what it is that they're trying to change. And if this sounds unusual, then it's been true to a greater or lesser extent on every single transformation I've worked on over decades. So what happens is organizations don't know in enough detail what they do or why they do it. So what are the processes that shouldn't exist anymore because they apply to a circumstance that hasn't existed for 15 years. They don't know what they do, why they do it, or how they can change. And what that tends to mean is that they defer transformation. Transformation is too hard to think about, so they bundle it up into big chunks. Because of that, they aren't in the habit of change. And when they do undertake it, it's very difficult. It's very difficult for them to estimate and understand because they haven't got the information available to allow them to do it. And it tends to be delivered as a silo, a program, or a transformation unit that's alongside the existing. And of course, that unit has all the same problems about organizational silos that the rest of the organization does. And that can mean that the almost inevitably, the transformation will be declared a success because something will happen, but actually it won't finish what it was intended to do. And I've worked in a number of organizations, a large retailer, for example, where when they were undertaking transformation number 3, they still hadn't finished 2 transformations ago. The difficulty here is that, as Kahneman says, people simply don't recognize that this is a problem. It's not visible to people, so they don't see it. They just charge on, do what they do, and see what happens in the end. So if that's a kind of vicious circle on the left-hand side, there is a virtuous circle on the right-hand side, and new practices like agile and product management and lean IT and lots of modern practices are about building this virtuous circle on the right, about exercising change, building change capabilities, building flexibility, and integrating change into business as usual. That's easy to say. Again, it's hard to do because a lot of the difficulties associated with this aren't visible. But let's think about transformation with AI now. Whoops, going the wrong way. So what does this mean for AI? So first of all, in terms of trade-offs, now one of the great advantages of AI is that it's possible to do information processing faster, better, and cheaper. So that's got to be a good thing. But there's an issue that we're already aware of around bias and ethics, which comes about when short-term trade-offs associated with AI, in other words, the need to deliver something now, overcome a more mature consideration about their impact. But there is actually a deeper question here as well. We know that information processing is about making trade-offs, and we know that trade-offs are about simplification. So there's a deep question here about when is simplification different from bias? When we say bias, what do we actually mean, and what's the relationship between these two things? And I won't pretend I've got an answer to that question. Secondly, habits. What habits have to be unlearned, and what new habits have to be learned? Habits are very, very deeply embedded. So, for example, one of the difficulties of digital transformation has been embedding agile practices and reducing waterfall thinking. In the UK, the Government Digital Service was founded about a decade ago. And although it's made giant strides in the provision of digital services, there are still large pockets of old school thinking dotted about. And there are analogies here with other disciplines. So, for example, Max Planck, when he was talking about paradigm shifts in science, said basically that paradigm shifts, that new paradigms only get implemented when the old generation dies or retires. Habits are very, very deeply embedded, so we can't ignore them, and especially when we're dealing with something that's as different as AI. But what habits do we need to consider with AI? I'll just give a couple of examples quickly. First, machine learning is probabilistic. People are not comfortable with probabilities. We've seen in the pandemic how discussions of false positives, false negatives, and the perception of effectiveness of vaccines has been very difficult for people to understand. the second habit is around data. So traditionally, data was a byproduct of a process. You tried to do something, you gathered some information, you stored it somewhere, but it was the doing the process that mattered. And all the habits were designed around doing the process. But now, of course, the data in itself is very important. And anyone who's worked on a data migration activity knows that poor data quality is rife in organizations because the habits don't exist to make it a good quality. One of the things that data scientists become very uncomfortable with when they start work is that they spend an awful lot of their time trying to sort out data rather than doing the science. Finally, thirdly, fragmentation. So how can AI affect fragmentation? Well, it can be a good thing because it can help connect silos together. But as we saw earlier, it can also change the relationship between people and technology. And this is probably one of the most difficult questions that AI transformation needs to address. How can we help people to trust the technology? And in cases where complex tasks are being passed from one to the other, how can we make sure that the people and the technology have the right situational awareness to make the right decisions? Finally, how can AI help organizations to change? So the promise is built into the term machine learning. So if we can learn more about the environment, that's great. But making the change will need some more mature consideration. If we go back to the insurance claim example earlier, if you make changes automatically, and for example, your risk tolerance changes, that means you may be automating less, and you may not have enough people to do the work that was previously automated. So this needs a very dynamic thinking about the visibility of changes. Thinking about visibility, there are a number of hard questions here. We heard earlier about process discovery and technology discovery, and AI can help in learning about what an organization actually does. But when AI is plumbed into the core of a business, it can cause all sorts of dynamic effects. And there may be a number of different models in different places operating differently. And it's important to understand how they relate to each other. And there's a deeper problem, really, which Taleb referred to in his in the book The Black Swan. So this is about how do we make decisions about rare extreme events. If we're increasingly trusting AI and machine learning models, how do we know when we shouldn't trust them? How can we be skeptical enough to understand that the model isn't just driving off a cliff like it did in the financial crash in 2007 and 8? So let's put these pieces together in the last couple of slides. So we know that AI requires very different organizational habits. So it requires a more thorough approach to transformation. Too often the focus for transformation is just about connecting up an organization in a slightly different way, implement some new technology, change the process a bit, train the people. That's simply not enough with AI. Critical habits of the organization need to change. And in order to do that, the trade-offs that apply, the organizational mechanisms, the structure, the performance management need to be aligned with the new habits that are required. And none of this can happen, it's happened to me again. And none of this can happen if all of this isn't made visible to people, because of what we saw earlier about the limitations that people have about information processing. If they don't have visibility of the habits and their impact, if they don't have visibility of the trade-offs and their impacts, then these things won't be considered as part of transformation because it won't be part of the way that people think. So let's put the pieces together finally. So going back to the first slide about digital transformation, we know we new data and AI capabilities around data engineering, data science, and so forth. And these may be embedded in an organizational construct like a center of excellence or something like that. We know that we need some enabling capabilities around organization and culture change, that we need a data-aligned technology architecture, that we need to adopt modern practices around product management and managing activities through the life cycle so that change and business as usual are integrated together. We need an integrated delivery model, and we need to think about what we understand about the way in which information processing works in the organization. All of the organizational literature and all of the organizational digital transformation practice says that it's not a one-off activity, it's a continuous process, and it's about iterating, testing, and learning. But we also need to make sure that we embed in this principles along the lines that we've been discussing. So we need to understand how information processing works, why it happens that way, and what its limits are. And we need to do it with enough skepticism that we can understand when we can trust the models and when we can't. And that needs to be built into the transformation. We need to make trade-offs that align with success. We need to remove the trade-offs, the organizational mechanisms, the performance management, which is about delivery at all costs, for example, so that we can build the right kind of habits we need to make AI successful. And we need to understand what those habits are. So we talked about data, we talked about the impact of probabilities, and there are several others that we need to consider. That we need to start doing the right things. And this is almost the easiest thing. It's easier to think about what's new that's needed than to think about undoing the old things that are wrong because they're so deeply embedded. And we need to build capabilities to connect flexibly because we know that things are going to change. So finally, slightly over time, we know that delivering the promise of AI is difficult. We know that organizations are complicated information processing entities, and that implementing AI requires fundamental changes to the information processing trade-offs, habits, fragmentation, and visibility that organizations have. But that human psychology limitations make these changes difficult. Therefore, we need to include a set of principles that will enable these things to be visible and enable transformation to be successful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. That was indeed a very lucid narrative. Couple of, the chat box has started buzzing with questions, Paul. So shall we pick them up?
Sure. How do I see it?
You don't have to worry. I'll
Okay.
read them out to you, Paul.
Okay.
So we have a question from Galina Kondrateva. Dear Dr. Walton, thank you very much for this talk. You have explained very clearly the process of transformation. Speaking about the transformation with AI, what kind of unintended consequences have you seen, if there are some?
Yes, so I mentioned earlier about AI by stealth. So developers picking up AI tools and implementing them. And in one of the government organizations I've worked in, they happened, but they started doing this, but they hadn't yet thought through issues about ethics or bias or any of those questions. So people did lots of work, and then they decided, probably quite rightly, that they just had to stop all the activities because they couldn't go ahead with them because they had no idea what impact they'd have. In another case, also in a public sector organization, this issue I was talking about the triaging inputs for case management, they made us they introduced some machine learning tools to help them automate, and they tried to make the changes automatically without understanding the operational implications of those changes, which meant that they didn't have enough people to do the work. And those are just two, simple examples of things that can happen. But I think there are probably dozens of examples out there that people could identify.
So, Paul, let me kick off with a couple of questions myself. When you go in and have conversations with companies about AI-driven business transformation, are companies willing to look at a strategic point of view, or do they keep focusing on that fragmentation piece that you referred in your presentation, and they focus their energies around that piece itself? What have you seen from your experience?
I think that's it. I think that's exactly right. I think they find it very, very difficult to think through the implications, because the organizational habits that they're in go extremely deeply. Even the way they think about innovation doesn't necessarily involve challenging the way they think about doing finance approvals, for example, or the way they think about their core performance management system. But these are things often that stop things happening.
Yes.
So I think that's exactly right. It takes organizations a long time to think through the implications and to understand how deep they need to think in order to make things happen.
And if you then need to push that kind of engagement forward, do you actually, as a company, take a step back from the AI piece or the IT piece and say, hey, let's go behavioral or thought process or HR, and let's first analyze the thinking and the decision making at the CXO layer? Do you get into those kinds of engagements as the top end of business transformation?
I think I'd probably put it the other way around, which is that if you don't do that, then it's not going to be successful.
Okay.
And that kind of leadership coaching almost is a critical part of it.
Okay. So that's very interesting that you need to actually do leadership coaching in order to achieve success with AI-driven transformation projects.
And I think the distinction is between, lots of people do AI proof of concepts,
Yes.
and they're very successful, and they get touted as, we're doing AI. The difficult piece, and the piece that requires the leadership, is trying to scale those things across an organization, because they touch so many different bits of the organization, and that needs the leadership involvement.
Indeed. Because very often organizations, be it Capgemini or any others, you are almost like a visitor to the house in which leadership and their employees live. And it's kind of touch points that they expose to you, and they have to own that house. They live in that house day in, day out.
Exactly right, and a lot depends on their attitude. In some cases, they look to third parties to articulate some of the questions that they kind of know, but they just want someone else to confirm that they know it.
Sure. Okay, great. Paul, would you like to walk us through a use case or a case study of an actual corporate business transformation which was driven by AI? I mean, just profile the customer, if you may, and how you went through the process.
Okay. It's a public sector organization. It started off as a program, as a separate silo, looking at lots of machine learning use cases. And then incrementally, it did a number of things. So first of all, the program was turned into a core part of the organization. So it was no longer a separate silo. It was embedded in various bits of the organization. It was accompanied by a complicated set of business change activities, engaging with the different directorates in the organization around their their needs, and trying to drill into these questions about, what does it mean in terms of culture, habits, how could it be introduced, how can the operational implications of implementing it be understood, and that activity has been taking place over probably, I'm trying to work it out, maybe 6 years now. So it started off small and gradually, incrementally added various pieces in until it became more and more and more fundamental to the organization.
Okay, so it's kind of an ongoing journey.
It has to be a journey, yes. I mean, it can't be a one-off activity. It has to be a journey. So many things need to be changed in order to make it happen. And the difficult task is picking on, what to do next.
Indeed. Thank you, Paul. We are at the top of the hour, but with your permission, could we take one last question?
Of course.
Okay, great. We have a question from Neelam Savaikar from Malaysia. So Neelam asks, Dr. Walton, could you help me understand the application of AI in the field of education and knowledge exchange? What are some of the biggest challenges there? And if you could recommend any books. Thank you.
So I'm not sure I understand the question. What was the question about trying to transform an education organization?
Yeah, I think so.
Well, it's a good question. I have no experience of transforming educational organizations, so I'm not sure there's much I can add there beyond the generic points that we've been talking about. Except I know, well, I suppose I know that the educational, the silos are very deep in educational organizations, and certainly each part goes about its thinking in very different ways. But I'm not sure there's much I can add to that because I don't know about the education.
Maybe I can take a crack at it, Paul, with your permission.
Of course.
Sure. So at SIBM, we've just completed our recruitment process for our new MBA graduates. And one of the analytical tools that we used to psychometrically profile candidates was analyzing their handwriting to elicit 5 or 6 criteria that we look for in candidates. And this psychometric analysis of their handwriting was actually presented to a live human panel as part of running the overall assessment center. So that's how, in our own humble way at SIBM Pune. And by the way, the scale is amazing. So we look at a pool of about 85,000 candidates who write our entrance exam online, and we shortlist 2,500. And each of those 2,500 candidates were profiled psychometrically using this handwriting analysis. So that was how we did it. Hopefully it helped us achieve some better outcomes, because the software progressively gets better as it looks for patterns and correlates those with the traits that we actually look for in the incoming cohort.
And how do you avoid questions of bias in that case?
So this was our first year. So we used the dashboard of the graphology profiling as an input to the panels. Okay. And panels were then free to look at the choices that they had made after running the assessment center and see whether that correlated with the kind of answers which the tool was giving them. And we would then put that back as further learning for the tool. And of course, we follow a double-blind system between the actual instruments used in the assessment center process. So there are ways that we try and keep the bias out. That's great. Good. So, Paul, many thanks for your time, your expertise, your knowledge, and answering all those questions patiently. I'm sure Capgemini looks at possibly a pan-Europe or maybe even global. Do you look at global engagements, or is it UK or Europe centric?
No, it is global as well.
Okay, I would assume so. So maybe in some of your travels, if you have the occasion to visit India, we would be delighted to host you, Paul, in India. We are based in Pune. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much for that session. Also, a big thanks to Dr. Yogesh Dwivedi, Dr. Raman, our co-hosts for the session, dear participants for their active participation, the questions. I would be remiss if I don't mention our IT team led by Mr. Rajesh Bhagewadi, who's organized the infrastructure. And last but not the least, Paul, we have our student team called iSmart. They have been peeping in into our session, and within a few minutes, they'll create some electronic frames of some snapshots that they have taken. If you visit us, we would actually give you the frame as you walk off the stage. That they are that fast. So they are there in the session as well. Thanks to them. And our next session will be next week, same time, by Dr. Rohit Nishant, and that's on artificial intelligence and social challenges. So we'll take a look at that. Paul, once again, thanks a ton. We hope to stay connected and exchange ideas and hopefully create some mutual synergies.
Absolutely. Well, thanks very much for the opportunity, and it's very good to talk to you.
Our pleasure. Have a great afternoon and a great week ahead. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Bye then.
Bye.